Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to go from what I'll be calling quadratic form of a quadratic equation into vertex form. So I say I'm calling it quadratic form because you'll see some other references that call it standard form, but I don't want to use standard because we actually use that word to refer to a different format. So we're just going to call it quadratic form. And this would be your standard ax squared plus bx plus c. So this is the form you're used to seeing when we do things like factoring, completing a square, using the quadratic equation, all of those things. All we really know about this is that a, b, and c are constants. It could really be any number. And the other thing that we know is that the a will actually tell you whether the parabola opens up or down. So when a is positive, we know that you're going to have an open-facing parabola, and when a is negative, you'll have a downward-facing parabola. So that's really all we know about the graph just by looking at that format of the equation. Vertex form, on the other hand, is a little bit nicer. So let me show you what that looks like. We still have a. This is the same a that you have in quadratic form. But now we have a quantity squared with x, and then we have a constant at the end. So, sorry. What's nice about this, a does the exact same thing that it does in quadratic form. When it's positive, it's an opening up parabola. When it's negative, it's facing down. But in addition, we know that the vertex will be h comma k. So the reason this is called vertex form is because you can pull the vertex out of it just by looking at it. Notice that there is a minus sign built in to this format. That means that the sign will always change. So when you pull that out, whatever the sign is in the parenthesis, you're going to switch it to the opposite sign. The k will stay exactly the same. So if you know that the vertex is hk, that means that the axis of symmetry is x equals h. Sorry, this is a little squished here at the bottom. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to go from quadratic form to vertex form and all the things that we can figure out based off of that. Okay, so the very first thing that we do is we change our y into a 0, and we do that because we want to actually start completing the square, and typically when we complete the square, we're set equal to 0. So we're going to kind of ignore the y for a bit, and then it will come back into play at the end. So once I've changed that into a 0, I'm going to divide everybody by whatever the number is that's sitting in front of x squared, just like I normally would do when I complete the square. So now I have 0 equals x squared minus 4x plus 7 over 2. I know you might be tempted to write 3.5 here, but keep that as a fraction. You'll see at the end how that fraction will end up turning back into a whole number. Okay, so the next thing I do when I complete the square is I move my c term. I'm subtracting 7 over 2 to both sides. Now I have negative 7 over 2 equals x squared minus 4x. Okay, so now is the part in the completing the square where you actually do the completing the square part. So we're going to take our b, the negative 4, pull it off to the side, divide it by 2, and square it. So now that number, the result of that little operation that we're doing there, is going to get added to both sides. So since that will come out to positive 4 after you've squared it, I'm adding 4 to both sides of the equation. Okay, so at this point I'll be ready to combine the numbers on the left and to actually turn the right-hand side into a squared binomial. So if you want to pause your video really quick and just calculate negative 7 over 2 plus 4. Okay, hopefully that gave you 1/2. Oops. And over here, this will turn into x minus 2 squared. If you forgot how we come up with that, if we take our answer from back over here when we divided, but before we squared it, I would have gotten negative 2, which is why that's what goes in the parentheses. Now I actually stop completing the square, because usually what I would do right now is I would square root both sides and solve for x, but that's not our goal here. Our goal is to get into vertex form. So I'm hoping you're starting to see that this is beginning to look like vertex form. I have that quantity squared with x, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that half and I'm going to move it back over. So I will have that k at the end once I do this. So make sure you're not trying to combine the negative 2 and the negative half. Though one of them's inside of a parenthesis with an exponent, so you cannot bring the negative 1/2 in. That means I would normally be left with a 0 over here. I'm going to turn that 0 back into a y right now. So remember, I did that little switch at the beginning, and so now I'm just switching it back. And over here, I have x minus 2 squared minus 1/2. So this looks a lot like vertex form. The only problem is I don't really want a fraction here, but that's okay. I'm going to get rid of it by multiplying this equation by what I divided by in the beginning. So if you remember back, the very first step we did was we divided by 2. I actually bring that 2 back now because I have to keep this completely balanced because I'm not solving anything. So this 2 will get distributed in. It's going to sit in front of this parenthesis. I can't distribute something into a parenthesis with an exponent, and then it'll get multiplied by this -1/2. So my final answer for vertex form. So my final answer is y equals 2 parentheses x minus 2 squared. And if I do -1/2 times 2, I should get -1. And so that right here is my final vertex form. Okay, so why do we care? Well, now I know a few things about the graph, and I could actually even come up with a quick sketch. And so this is really much easier for graphing purposes than the quadratic form we had earlier. So based on this, I know that the direction of this parabola, or the way that it's facing, you could either write it opens up or just draw an open facing parabola. And again, I know that because this value at the front, who we call A, he's positive. My vertex, if you remember, we talked about this earlier, you're going to change the sign of the number with x, so that becomes +2. And the k at the end just stays the same, so that's just 2, -1. And then my axis of symmetry is x equals 2. Remember, the axis of symmetry cuts right through the vertex, which is why those 2's are the same. And so that's converting and coming up with some information about the graph. What I have on the next page is another example. So if you're interested in practicing this and you want to see if you're able to do it by yourself, what I would do right now is I would pause the video and then play it once you have an answer, or if you get stuck and you can see my solution worked out. So I'm going to go ahead right now and do the same thing that we did on the other example, changing him to a 0. Notice he doesn't have a number sitting in front of him per se, but he does have a negative, which means it's really a -1. So just like I did before, I do have to divide by that because I need x squared completely by itself. So I'm going to divide everybody by -1. Okay, so that means I still have 0 here. Now I have positive x squared, which is what I wanted, minus 6x plus 4. Okay, so I'm going to start completing the square. Now I'm going to do the completing the square step. Take my b, it's -6. Divide them by 2 and square them. That gives me 9, so I'm going to add 9 to both sides. Okay, on the left-hand side, I'm going to combine those numbers to get +5. And over here, I'm turning my trinomial into a squared binomial. I'm going to be putting a -3 here because that's the answer I get over here when I do my division. Okay, now I stop completing the square and I start turning this into my vertex form. So the 5 comes back over. Remember, I am not combining -5 and -3. One's inside parentheses trapped and the other one's not. I'm changing this 0 back into a y. And this almost looks like I'm finished, but I know better because I divided by -1 in the very first step, so I'm bringing that -1 back now at the end. So this whole thing is getting multiplied by -1, which means it'll sit in front of my parenthesis and it'll also multiply to the -5. This is negative x minus 3 squared, and now this is +5. So this is my final answer in vertex form. And that will identify what we know about its graph. Okay, so my direction, or the way that this parabola will open, is going to be down because it has a -a value, that number right in front, which is really just like a -1. My vertex is +3 because I changed that sign, and then I keep the k the same. And my axis of symmetry then would cut through right at x equals 3. And that's it.